well, the good guys are outnumbered by the bad guys. That's just how it is. And that's why our side cannot relent. The other side is relentless. But if you're a happy warrior and you don't mind fighting, you can see some progress. And I'm pleased to say that the forces of freedom have a new ally. And the forces of freedom, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm talking about our counterparts at True North or Western Standard. The Fraser Institute, I'm talking about freedom-oriented groups like the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom or our friends at the Democracy Fund. Well, add to that constellation a new star. I'm talking about the Aristotle Foundation. Sounds high-minded because it is, but it's dedicated to those principles of free inquiry and open debate, principles that have been eroded in Canada lately, where there's more cancel culture than debate culture. I'm delighted to have on the show the boss of the new Aristotle Foundation from his world headquarters in Calgary. I joke that we're in our world headquarters here. It's a small shop, but the Aristotle Foundation has good bones. They're dedicated to freedom, and it's a delight to talk to Mark Milke, their boss. And by the way, they're launching with a bang, a new book. Mark, great to see you.
Great to see you, Ezra. Thanks for having me on.
Well, come on. I mean, you're going to be a regular here. I just know it because you have made a decision about the course of your life's work that you were going to chair the Foundation for Public Policy called the Aristotle Foundation. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about your project that you're launching with your debut, your new book. But first, give me a little bit of background on the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. You're a registered Canadian charity headquartered in Calgary. What's your official mission?
Well, our mission is to champion reason, democracy, and civilization, or civil society, as people might know it. Now, you're right. It sounds very kind of highfalutin, but basically we want to make people think, because I think a lot of people, or some people anyway, in the chattering classes, and it filters down, are not thinking these days. So is it reasonable to say Canada is a systemically racist society? In the new book, which we'll talk about in a moment, Matthew Lau says, no, it's not reasonable. How about democracy? Why do the Swiss get to vote on a carbon tax and vote it down, where Americans can vote in marijuana, and Canadians are told we just have to behave, not challenge the political class or anyone else? I think democracy needs some reform and a dose of direct democracy, actually, in Canada. And how about civilization? Again, a very old-fashioned word. A couple of years ago, I read about a little town called Cranbrook, a city in British Columbia, not far from where I grew up in the interior of British Columbia. Two gangs were fighting it out in the streets, and then they went to the hospital and fought it out in the hospital. Think about a small city. How do you deal with that? I was reading yesterday in National Review a great article on Ontario schools and some of the violence. Is this the kind of civilization, the civil society, the country we want? So the Aristotle Foundation was set up to make people think about some of these claims, some of these issues. And, we're underway with, and the first part of this is putting out a book that says, you want to cancel Canada? Really? You think that's a great idea? We've got 20 authors in the book that say, maybe you want to rethink that.
Well, let's get right into the book. The book is called The 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Canceled. And it's a group of essays. You mentioned one of them on systemic racism. And I think racism has been a human condition in every continent since the dawn of time. And in the past, it was just considered normal. I mean, you could even say the saying, birds of a feather flock together. I mean, I think it's only now that there's an emphasis of getting past that. I mean, really a blink of time in the history of man. And I think Canada has a noble place in that. We were the country that banned the slave trade more than 200 years ago. We were part of the British Empire's campaign against slavery. We were the destination for runaway slaves through the Underground Railroad. I think that Canada, if you judge us in the time in question, in this 18th century, in the 19th century, we were the most progressive place around. And I think an attempt to retroactively demonize our country as racist is historically illiterate, and it's wrong. That's my thought. What does Matthew Lau have to say? It sounds like he's a Chinese Canadian. You have a lot of minorities writing here, and they're writing things that are contrarian because the official woke view is, no, we're all racist. We're a genocidal state. John A. Macdonald's a war criminal. Tell me about some of these essays standing against this hurricane of woke.
Sure. You mentioned Matthew Lau's in the 1867 Project, and his chapter is key because there is this notion that Canada is systemically racist today. What Matthew does is he adds some history and some statistics to this claim and then rebuts the claim. So how he does that, he says, look, yeah, 70 years ago or 100 years ago, there was discrimination against minorities in this country. But today, if you look at the income stats, right, you look at ethnicity, you look at income, well, who's at the top of the heap income-wise? It's those with East Asian origins, for example, himself from the Chinese community. If you look at Japanese Canadians, if you look at someone from Taiwan, as opposed to China proper, but generally East Asian Canadians are at the top of the income heap, which is a good thing. Now, it doesn't mean there's not individual bigots out there or prejudice. And Matthew makes this distinction in the 1867 Project. But to find a bigot out there is not the same thing as saying Canada is systemically racist. And people are not clear in this. And that's the problem these days. People don't make distinctions. They don't actually define what they mean when they talk, including politicians, a lot of them, and a lot of the media. So what's a good reminder of what systemic racism is? Let's go back 100 years to San Francisco. Back then, whites in San Francisco would not allow those of Chinese origin into their white hospitals. The Chinese of San Francisco had to build their own hospitals. That's institutional racism. Or Ontario, before the early 1950s. You could discriminate against someone based on color or ethnicity in terms of employment, accommodation. But laws were passed against that in 1951, 1952. And yet 70 years later, we have governments and politicians pulling their hair out as if, this is Canada in 2023 is Alabama in 1923. It's really quite ridiculous. Yeah. So Matthew Lau does a nice job of taking down this claim that Canada is systemically racist, at least against minorities. You do see government policy these days that is what I'd call reverse racism. I had to ask one dean at the University of Calgary to defend a hiring policy that was very specific to one color. And they said, really? So you wouldn't hire the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor because you think she's privileged? So it's amazing to me, actually, how we've lost ground on this issue, Ezra. That unfortunately today, old evils are cropping up in new guises, new justifications, discrimination against the individual, as opposed to, no, celebrate the individual, discriminate based on merit, hire on merit, that sort of thing. So we've actually, I think, lost some ground, unfortunately.
Huh. And you're comparing things to Canada and San Francisco in the last century, but I think you can take a broader comparison. Why just compare us against our own recent past? Why not compare us to every single other country and continent in the world? I think there's a myth that only the West was racist or only whereas today, there is still slavery in several continents. There is still overt racism and discrimination in several continents. What other country in the world is better than Canada? I don't think there's a good answer to that. Listen, I want to whip through some of the other subjects. Give me just short snappers on each of these. Greg Piasecki, if I'm saying it wrong, takes on the case of Sir John A. Macdonald. Here in Toronto, there's a great statue of Sir John A. Macdonald right in the heart of the city. And they built a wooden coffin around it so no one has to look at it. It's insane. The founder of this country is in a wooden coffin in the biggest city because the city fathers are too ashamed of him. Give me a one-liner of why Greg Piasecki says that's wrong.
Well, because he favored treaties and carried out treaties in the West, specifically to make sure that what happened in the American West didn't happen in the Canadian West. Founded the Northwest Mounted Police to protect the first settlers, you could say, from later settlers and vice versa, but first settlers from later settlers. And he provided famine relief. Plus, he was instrumental as part of the effort to inoculate Indigenous Canadians against smallpox. So for all those reasons and more, Greg details why John A. Macdonald, as he puts it, saved more Indigenous lives than any other prime minister.
That was an excerpt from the Ezra Levant show. I'm Ezra Levant. Every weekday, I do a monologue about the topic of the day. Then I interview a fascinating guest either in studio or via Skype. And then I read your mail, whether it's fan mail or hate mail, which is sometimes even more interesting. This is on our premium service, though, called Rebel News Plus. Go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month or less if you buy a whole year in advance. You get my show every weeknight, plus Sheila Gunn Reid's show every week. It's called The Gun Show. It's pretty amazing. You know, we rely on you because we do not take a dime from the government. In Canada, that makes us almost unique. So please help us out and help yourself to some great journalism at rebelnewsplus.com.